So we want to select and choose our partner. We've got a lot of good reasons to do that. Um, the interaction between the disaster recovery partner and the institution becomes pretty important at that point. What are some things that you think are key issues or key points, really, not issues, but key points to address if we're going to develop a quality relationship that will serve us months from now when something happens, following years perhaps of nothing happening?
Sure. Well, the first thing is you got to get back from around back, get out of your desk. You got to get out there. You got to meet the client. You're going to have to take time to sit with the decision makers and those that are responsible for running the university at a luncheon, at a table. You know, they need to understand sort of what it is you're going to provide. You need to develop a relationship. This is a relationship business at the end of the day. They should be able to call 24/7 and not speak to an answering service. They should be able to speak to a representative from that company. We should both understand when you tell me to go, what that order to proceed information consists of. When I arrive, where do you want me to go? Where do you want me to stage? Who do you want me to talk to first? And if that first person isn't available, who is my second or third person I need to talk to? And really just sort of walk through those first 72 to 96 hours, you know, and then you got to throw in the variables. Hey, we don't have power. My email is down. I don't know how to communicate. I got to work with my secondary communication plan. So really, communication is at the center of everything outside of building that relationship. But more importantly, who are we talking to? Where are we going to assemble? How are we going to go about fixing what's been disrupted?
Good point. So there's a rapport that has to be developed, and that rapport brings a level of trust to the table. We trust one another, and probably as critical, if not more so, is familiarity with the facilities.
That is very important to be able to walk them, understand them. Some are very good. You know, first thing we want to understand is really what is the power needs of a facility? What are the backup power needs of a facility? Are there options that students can come back to school but work on a certain part of the campus that wasn't disturbed? All these type of variables play into the equation. Security is a big equation. We want to talk to the campus police. We want to ensure that the campus police know who we are. More importantly, outside of the campus police, there's going to be local jurisdictions at the municipality, at the county or parish level, and even at the state level. We're going to interact with everybody, and everybody's going to know who that vendor is. And that's very, very important right there. So communication, and with communication also comes an extent of when do you want to be updated? You know, how do you want to be updated? Those first 96 hours, that leadership is having to answer a lot of questions, higher and lower. When is the appropriate time that you want to be briefed? How do you want to be briefed? Everything's going to be written down, but at some point you got to bring that team together. You got to listen to what the vendors did today and what they're going to do tomorrow. Don't get too far out in front of you know, what is going on. Just try to work through those first 24 hours in a cycled manner, because you're also going to be physically tired, you know. And when that event, if it's complex in nature, hits in that local community, we have to be cognizant that if we're coming from outside in, not only are you worried about your institution being recovered, you have the precious cargo, which are your children that you're thinking about. You have the community, which potentially could have been damaged, and you have your own family that potentially have needs there. So, you know, to think that, oh, you're just concerned about one thing, that's disingenuous. We know that you've got multiple things that you're thinking about. We have to be respectful and mindful of that. So I can't overemphasize both non-verbal communication, verbal communication, and written communication are key to success.
So we kind of hinted at the first 96 hours. So I want to back out of that.
Sure.
Because there's still some things I'd like for us to address with the whole preparation
Sure.
part of that relationship. So we're developing a partnership with our disaster recovery partner. Um, how do we go about doing that? It's from my perspective, as I guess I've been through this from the trenches. It was important to have representatives from the disaster recovery service meet with our key stakeholders, our operations folks, our police department, our emergency management office, risk management office. Sometimes you don't think about it, but procurement services
Big time.
needs to be included in those discussions. And because the service is not something that's going to be called upon on a daily basis, you build those relationships up front, but there may not be a disaster for months, years. How do we maintain that working relationship so that even if there's been changes in management or changes in leadership, when the time happens and you walk through the door, we still know who you are?
Right.
How do you address that? How do we go about working through that?
Well, I think the first thing is to really understand your vendor's capabilities. So, as you indicated earlier, having all the key people in a meeting, and time is important to be respectful of that, is to have that vendor give you a down and dirty on their current capabilities. More importantly, as we talked earlier about really having turnkey capabilities, does your vendor know how to operate both in a man-made event versus maybe a natural disaster event? A lot of times we talk about wind, we talk about flood, we may even talk about earthquake or surge as being a peril, but active shooter is a big thing that needs to be addressed. What do you do when you have a man-made event? Maybe power outage wide on the campus has occurred. How do you go in and sequence those man-made events? You could have a large CapEx project that needs an enormous amount of post-construction cleanup that could augment and facilitate working with operations or facilities. So really understanding both how that vendor can augment and support both day to day from a capacity standpoint to help your university or your school district, but more importantly, if you do have a man-made event that shuts your university or your school down, or if you do have a weather event that shuts your university or school down, how does that vendor come in and work and augment with their capabilities? Capabilities have to be sequenced in. They can't all be piled in at one given time. It's a disaster. You're waiting for failure if you do that.
So thinking about all of those things, the cost is something that a risk manager institution is going to be concerned about. And I would propose, based on our discussion and my history, that there's soft cost,
Absolutely.
which is the time spent investing in developing that partnership, the time spent having our partners meet your specialists as the disaster recovery provider, having those open discussions about, well, just exactly what do you do? And our people, the university folks, understanding, hey, they really are a partner. They are not just a, fly-by-night type person. This is a partnership. They're here for the long haul. There's really zero hard cost up front
No, there's not, Steve.
for all of this, right?
No, there's not. Contracts should be in place and approved. Those contracts have been really checked two or three or four times. One, what type of contract mechanism do we have in place? Insurance, education components have all vetted it and said it's good to go. We have a rate sheet that everybody agrees to is fair, and that'll be utilized over a given period of time. Procurement has already gone ahead and put the vendor in to the procurement system. So that vendor should know their vendor ID number. That university already has that vendor's insurance on record, and they understand that we are meeting our responsibilities as a vendor to work at that university or that school district from an insurance. Bonding is a big deal. Can't overlook that. Does your vendor have the QA and QC, the quality assurance and compliance necessary to work on that in that university? Do they have the certifications for lead? Do they have the certifications for abatement? What does their OSHA documents look like? Have they had any massive safety violations that might be frowned upon? So you got to take all that into consideration too on the front end, on the preparation side, to really show that you do have a high-end quality disaster recovery company. Once you get all that sort of aligned, then it's just a matter of walking through notification. You called me, you have business interruption, tell me what you know, tell me who you need me to talk to, and now we're coming. And we're going to come and we're going to sequence in our capacity. Once we really truly understand what the business interruption is, simultaneously capacity is showing up. We're staging that capacity right there. We're marking that from a life, health, safety standpoint. We're getting that property stabilized. We're documenting everything. And at some point in time within those first 24 hours, we're prepared to give leadership there and the representatives with leadership sort of an update on what we think the findings are and what we think the appropriate courses of action are to get that property back to pre-loss condition. And that's very, very important. You don't have days to make those findings. You have hours. And I would say that within 24 hours, you should be able to present your initial findings documented and already discussed with those representatives of the school district or university that say, we agree with those findings.
That's a tight time frame. But we're talking about a process that's been going on for several months in the who, what, where, when, and how.
That's correct.
Of those questions. Tabletop exercises in preparation for a disaster and the response thereto and the recovery therefrom. Your thoughts on that?
Well, one, I like them. Two, nobody likes to exercise their programs, but the difference between a program and a plan is your program is being exercised. And I can't emphasize that. But the university, for the most part, will have the historical institutional knowledge about exactly what business interruption they've had at that university. You know, we had a power outage, or we had a snow event, or we had a flood or a wind event. They'll know what that is, and they'll be able to talk about it. You know, we had X amount of roofs that got damaged, or we had structural damage, and you'll be able to really listen to them on the front end, and then you pick a couple of scenarios. I always say you can pick 2 or 3 scenarios. You should be able to walk through that first 20 minutes, but everybody at that exercise has to have inputs. You can't just hear from the vendor there. You want to hear from campus police. You have to hear from facilities. You have to understand procurement. If it's a major wide event where a federal declaration has been declared, that opens up the Stafford Act. So now we're talking about FEMA reimbursable.
And that is always so quick, isn't it? They are Johnny on the spot, aren't they?
They got to be Johnny on the spot at least when you're documenting it, and you always take the appropriate step forward to say, even though it's not been declared, we are still going to document it as if it's going to be declared. Because the last thing you want to do is go back and redo paperwork. And so we try to maintain one standard when it comes to paperwork, especially working in the education vertical market.
And having that expertise in your external partner is such a relief to the risk manager because we don't often have to deal with FEMA. Hopefully, we never have to deal with FEMA. So we've been talking about the why do we need the service and what are some of the advantages of having that service. And we've talked some about the preparation, talked about tabletop exercises, and you mentioned everyone at the table having input. True story. Tabletop exercise at my former university. Uh, we were talking about how we were going to get heavy equipment into the central part of the campus so that high work could be done, elevated work could be done. It didn't have to be a crane, it could be a heavy piece of equipment, firefighting equipment. And how do you get into that central core? And we started talking about those routes, and our plant operations folks said, whoa, wait a minute. We need to overlay our tunnel map on this.
Yeah, we experienced that.
Great find, because you can't move some heavy equipment over tunnels, you'll collapse the tunnel. So that tabletop exercise is so critical in identifying that. You don't want to learn about that challenge at the moment the crane drops through the concrete.
So that you make a great point, Steve. I think a lot of times in that tabletop exercise, the things we find that come to fruition is one, staging of all your equipment. Where's the equipment going to be staged? Well, let me back up. Are students going to be in school or out of school? That right there makes a big difference. And education leadership understands exactly what I'm saying right there. Second thing is, we're going to be working on the campus. First thing I want to make sure is that security, campus security, or local law enforcement understand who we are. You have to be visually recognizable by your safety vest, your employment badge, and a second form of identification. Third thing, as you indicated, specialty equipment that's going to come onto a campus or a university. First one I think about is power. And so we're going to bring power onto the university. I show up with power. You look at me. I look at you. You keep looking at me. I go, Steve, what are you looking at me for? And you're like,
where are we going to plug it in?
Right. Aren't you going to hook it up? And I go, no. Where's your electrician? And so working through the devil in the details on power. But it's not good enough just to say power. We got to peel the onion back a little bit. You know, where's that power going to be distroed? How much, distribution lines do we need? Right. How much power? Well, we have power back to the university. You also may need supplemental power. What about fuel? Are those generators set up so they're in OSHA compliance? If you have a fuel spill, you don't want to have a mess. And then the specialized equipment plays a big role in so many different specialties. Having certified people to use booms, to use aerial lifts, scissor lifts, all these type of things, because the university also has pretty competent safety personnel. And those safety personnel stay on top of those vendors working on those universities. So does your vendor also have its own in-house safety component? That's very, very important. What is the safety management plan of your vendor? On top of looking at all their TIRs and their recordables and all the documentation, do you actually have your own in-house safety personnel that are going to show up and work with the university safety personnel? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have job hazard analysis. You're going to have daily safety meetings right there. And so those type of devil in the details, as we talked about earlier, about those tactical disconnects, safety definitely has to be at the tabletop exercise, talking to the vendor safety person. And I need those two linked up and talking. I need my project coordinators on the restoration side talking to the facilities guys. I need my guy at the university or school district who's in charge of construction talking to my construction guy immediately. I need my field accountant person talking to my procurement person of the university where the invoices and the bills and all the backup documentation is going to. So there's a lot of sort of hodgepodge breakouts that relationship building needs to occur too, on top of just the overall scheme of what a recovery effort looks like from the time you tell that vendor proceed.
Right. One last item on preparation, then I want to move to the first 96 hours.
Sure.
Is one disaster recovery service provider enough?
Never. You should never rely on one disaster recovery. At my organization, we always categorize things, one is zero, two is one. And so if you keep that mindset that if you have one, you have zero, if you have two, you have one, and you're good to go. That being said, how much capacity does your vendor have? And if you're one of the largest in the United States, then moving capacity to a geographical location should be pretty easy to do in the time of need. So really understanding what type of restoration, remediation, roofing, and construction capacity does that organization have? They should have redundancy built in. If they don't, then you need to look for a secondary company.
Makes sense.